Okay, hi everyone. I think people are in now. So I just want to welcome everyone. My name is Julie Montgomery. I'm the Vice President of Membership and Partnerships at SID Washington. You are now attending the Learning Lab. This is the 4th Learning Lab. So thank you for being here. We are at Culture is the New Office, Virtual Team Leadership for Pros. So if this is not where you meant to be, we hope you'll stay. So I wanted to introduce Tosca, who will be facilitating today's session. This is meant to be an interactive session. We'll have some polling. We'd love to hear it. We want it to be not so formal. So if you have questions, if you'd like to speak, please, we encourage you to do so. I know that you have all seen Tosca's bio on the site. She is basically, she's launched her own consulting practice called 5 Oaks Consulting. And I've actually known Tosca for a number of years. Our lives intersected when I was working with Interaction, and she was also working with the organization on the board. But I asked her a little bit about kind of some more personal background, something that was not in her official bio. So I asked her, like, why did she get involved in this in the sector, and what inspired her to do what she's doing? And she said she entered the sector 30 years ago when she was in the Netherlands, which is where she's originally from. And she had the fortune to work for all kinds of different organizations in international development. She's worked for a think tank, she worked for an NGO, she's worked for the UN and the World Bank, academia and consulting. So she's really had a diverse background. And she realized she loves to work across all the sectors, and she loves learning. And hence why, she's a great person for this learning lab. So now she's learning to run her own small consulting company. I also asked her a little bit about what her favorite one of her favorite places that she's traveled to, and why. And she said during her master's degree program, she went to the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. I probably mispronounced that. But she said she was fortunate enough to be the first white student admitted to the School of Social Work in Harare, Zimbabwe, since Zimbabwe's liberation from apartheid. And that really it impacted and influenced what she did in her career. She's the co-author of a new book, Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs. So she really is, we're really excited to have her here. I'm happy that you all are here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tosca.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session on Culture is the New Office, how to be a virtual team leader as a pro. We're going to launch immediately into a poll, and that's going to show up in a moment to get you all kind of your mind kind of wrapped around this topic of virtual team leadership. What's different about it? So here's the poll for you. What have you discovered to be some of the main differences between leading or managing virtual as different from co-located teams? I know we, at the moment during the pandemic, have no choice. Most of us are leading entirely virtual teams, but what have you discovered to be really distinct about that? So let's see some of your answers, and then I'll tell you in a moment a little bit about what are some of the challenges that come with leading virtual teams and what are some of the solutions, because there are some things that are distinct. So let's see what some of your discoveries have been about what's different about managing a virtual team. Less interaction, yes, especially certain kinds. Less informal interaction, very important point. Yes, we'll talk a little bit about that Too much screen time, very mentally draining. And we can talk if we have time in the Q&A about what the research says about why it's so mentally draining to have a lot of screen time, especially a lot of screen meetings. Screen fatigue, indeed. The mental drain is significant. Part of that is because our eyes are constantly trying to read these tiny pixelated images of other people, and because we're reading for facial, how our faces are moving, what our muscle movement is, to read what that means for what the mood is of somebody, what they mean, etc. Unsure about the tone to use in emails. Yes, a very good point. When we write, other people tend to understand what you're writing more negatively than what you may have meant to convey as a tone. Different time zones, of course, which we are constantly battling. Too much screen time, less co-creation. Interesting. Yes, that is possible unless you guard against that. There are some things you can do, some tech tools you can do to use that. You probably have already discovered some, but yes, very good. Okay, let's give it 10 more seconds. I'm counting down from 10 to 0. See more scheduled calls. If they are more one-on-ones, that is a good thing. But we'll talk about what kind of things you can do to create more emotional intelligence in your team and more trust. Isolating, yes. Absolutely. That is true. It doesn't 100% have to, but it definitely is a big risk. And this issue of how to keep engagement high. Yes. Thank you very much, everybody. That is a very solid first brainstorm. So, Shabnam, let's please stop the poll for now. Okay, I'm going to run you through the program for the next 50 minutes or so. It is a very short session. So I'm going to first lead you through about 10 minutes of my presentation on some of the challenges that we have with virtual teams. And if we can please have the poll, my slide deck back up. 10 minutes of a presentation by me on challenges. Then we'll do a kind of a check-in poll in the middle of that. Then we'll do part 2 of the presentation on solutions. And then we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. So feel free in the meantime, as Julie said, to put your questions and comments in the chat box. And Julie and Shabnam will bring that to my attention. And then we'll do a round-up poll at the end. So let's go to the first slide, please. Yes, so this is about me, specific challenges, but also specific solutions to virtual team leadership. I should warn you, we only have 55 minutes together. This is a very short teaser. I do some broader work around this issue, and I'm planning a virtual mini course on virtual team leadership that will go much more in depth. More about that in the spring, here in the US, at least spring. Next slide. So thank you. Yes, thank you. What are some specific challenges? Let me just make sure that I time myself. There we go. So there are, in a nutshell, 3 big buckets of challenges when it comes to virtual teams. One is that there are social inhibitors. We are holding back socially in virtual teams in a way that we don't do as much in face-to-face or co-located teams. Secondly, there are greater challenges to motivation. To staying motivated. And thirdly, we're seeing issues with performance monitoring. It's a little harder as a team leader to monitor the performance and to manage the performance. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, obviously, even before the pandemic, many virtual teams often started in an unplanned way, and managers and leaders were not prepared for the specific challenges that they faced. And my background, particularly in INGOs, definitely supports that. We used to have, even before the pandemic, of course, technical tools available. and they are getting better all the time, but there was often little planning on how they should be used and what tool to use specifically best for what purpose within the team. And most people would still tell you that virtual communication is less productive than face-to-face communication. One of the things that we're facing in virtual teams is that we have more of a sense of what the researchers call social distance. We have a greater difficulty of establishing a sense of shared identity. Next slide. A little quick reality check. So those teams that score better in terms of virtual team leadership performance also tend to perform better as face-to-face teams. So there are some factors that are correlated, but there are also some distinct things you can do to improve your virtual team's performance, as well as happiness. Next slide. Thank you. So what are these social inhibitors that I mentioned? In a nutshell, and this is really important, in virtual teams, it's more difficult to establish trust. The research is quite clear on that. It's more difficult to both give and receive feedback and to pick up the cues that we normally get from body language around what people mean. It's more difficult to feel empathy with each other in virtual teams. It is more difficult to convey, to share emotions and send emotional signals. It is more difficult, therefore, to feel connected to each other. And as a result, it is more difficult to keep up your motivation and your commitment to the team. So how can we develop more trust within our teams? We can do that by encouraging everyone within our teams to respond promptly to requests from other team members. We need to take the time to give substantive feedback so that people don't feel lost in ether space. We need to proactively suggest solutions as team leaders if we see our team struggling. And we need to, as team leaders, maintain a positive and a very supportive tone in our communications, and I'll return back to that. The research does show that virtual teams have a higher incidence of conflict, and at the same time, it is harder to manage conflict within teams. It is harder for us to maintain common mental models, views on the world, and to share norms together in virtual teams. It is harder to have that shared identity and shared understanding. It is harder to develop psychological safety, to be candid with each other in virtual teams. It is more likely that you will withhold information in virtual teams. There is more psychological distancing, and we tend to attribute more negative meanings to what people communicate, particularly in writing, even if the writer does not intend that. Next slide. What we also see as a next cluster of challenges in virtual teams is what the academics call social loafing. What do I mean by that? That is about people in teams will feel more tempted to hide in terms of their performance behind other people's performance. Because we feel more anonymous in the team, we think we can hide behind other people's performance a little bit more easily. We tend to be a little less involved. We participate a little less in our virtual teams, at least on average. We're tempted to do that. We tend to be a little less collaborative in virtual teams. We tend to hold back ideas that we have. And importantly, we have less of a sense that our individual contributions are actually rewarded. And there is some research to back up that sense. Namely, when you are, for instance, when you are in a hybrid team that is both virtual and co-located, where that is possible at the moment in COVID, the people who are virtual only, who are remote, are less likely to be seen by their team leaders as being worthy of stretch assignments, worthy of promotion. They are less likely to be rewarded. Next slide. So what that means is that it's harder to, as a team leader, to hold your team members accountable for lack of performance. It is harder to navigate language and cultural differences because we cannot interpret the body language. All we see is the little pictures in the Zoom box. It is more difficult for you as a team leader to capture mind share. What do I mean by that? To capture the full attention of your team leaders. When we are in virtual meetings, for instance, 70 to 80% of the time people are multitasking. It's a pretty depressing stat. And therefore, it's more difficult for you as a team leader to establish and communicate the team culture that you want to have, the set of kind of shared norms and habits and behaviors that you want the team to have. Next slide. And it is therefore, for all those reasons, harder to motivate your team, to keep your team motivated. People are more at risk of feeling isolated. As I said before, there is on average less opportunity for skill development, for training, for career growth when you are a virtual team member in a team that is, for instance, hybrid. It's harder to be noticed for high performance. So that means that our team members are at higher risk of being demotivated, and the loss of employee loyalty is a bigger issue. So leading from a distance can definitely be challenging. We need to think more how to use humor and rituals and ceremonies in order to maintain that motivation. So it is harder to appreciate how other people work. So when we are in a virtual team, we don't know much about the context in which our team members are operating, their home environment, what else is going on in their minds. And when we miss that kind of contextual information, we feel less connected to others in the team. And it also means that we will interpret the signals that people in our team send as more negatively. It's kind of the out of sight, out of mind phenomena. So these are, next slide, please. Some of the reasons why for you as a team leader, it's harder to monitor the performance of your team. You need to make sure that the task-related information, the social and the contextual information is proactively shared, right? We need to put more emphasis on recognizing our team member contributions. It is a little harder to know exactly in a virtual team what specific skills everybody brings into the team, and therefore to utilize those team skills fully. And it's harder to observe for you as a team member when people are deviating from the norms that you are expecting. And I see that people are bringing in questions already into the chat, which is great. Next slide. So what that means, before we get to part 2 of the presentation later in the session, I just already want to point to one particular thing, and that is that if we have different communication media, so we have, for instance, in principle, we need an instant chatting ability, we need a co-creation ability, virtually speaking, and we need the real-time or synchronous team meeting time. How to use the right communication means for the right purpose is really important. And in general, I would say that if you, as a team leader, need to share one-way information, what some people call broadcasting information, so one-way updating of information on processes or what's happening in the organization or policies, etc., do it through so-called linear media, so that it's text-based, right? That is your Slack channel, that is your Microsoft Teams channel, your text-based media, that is your emails if necessary. But if you need to be really working together on solving complex issues, when you need to deliberate issues, when you need to discuss sensitive information, and especially when you need to work through conflict, please use your richer media, meaning your Zoom, your Teams call, etc., where you have audio and video. Audio is very important, the tone of your voice. Video is extremely important, the eye contact. So with that, before we get to part 2, I want to take a moment to do another poll, and then we'll turn briefly to your questions in the chat box. So if we could bring up the next poll. And here is my question to you. What have you experimented with to solve for these challenges that I mentioned and others that I didn't have time to mention? And what has been your experience with your experiments in how to become a better virtual team leader? So let's hear it. Go to menti.com and use the code that you have on the screen to give me your inputs, please. In the meantime, I'll have a look at the chat. Okay, let's see what's there. Regular check-ins with no agenda. Yes, I'll say something to that as well. That is a very good tool to use. Virtual social gatherings, I think we've all for months and months now been experimenting with those. Acknowledging everyone is very, very important. Brief icebreakers, yes. Breakout groups, very important to not always be in plenary. Informal interest groups, interesting. Yes, I could see. So for instance, I know some organizations that have Slack channels that are purely based on hobbies or interest or things in the news that some people are interested in. Virtual water coolers, we'll talk about that in a moment. Group chat discussions, speed dating with co-work, interesting. I don't know that particular tool, but it sounds really good. Social events, 5 to 10 minutes small talk. Yes, those brief check-ins. It sounds like many of you have already applied a lot of good tools. Book clubs, interesting. Yes, very good ones. Excellent. Thank you so much for those poll inputs. Let's turn to a couple of questions in the chat box before I go to part 2 of my presentation. And we'll, by the way, we'll definitely have some space for audio engagement with each other. So somebody said in the chat box, how do I deal with the situation that some people in my team are working much longer hours now that they work virtually? So let me just say something in general. We've already seen from some early research that everybody thought they were going to work less hours because they don't have to do commute, etc. But actually we're working more hours. On average, at least here in the US, we're working about 1.5 hours more per day now, not less. So that is a real bummer. And we have the added mental drain of all the Zoom meetings. So being really, in terms of protocol for you as a team leader, setting real boundaries and making around how much, when you are gone from your screen, when you take breaks, when you are not available, right? And encouraging your team members to also put parameters, put boundaries around when they are available and communicating that clearly and when they're not available. Those things are really, really important. And when people put boundaries, you as a team leader need to encourage that. You need to hold that up as a behavior that you want to see more of. Because we're in this for the long haul with this pandemic. And my sense is that we will continue to work virtually for probably much more for the long term. Somebody asked about ceremonies and rituals. So what can we do? So virtual rituals you can do. For instance, if you have a big team meeting coming up, is it possible for you to send, to have some food delivered to each of your team members in their location on the same day before that meeting, so that we can have a virtual meal together? Can we make a habit of that you as a team leader take 15 minutes coffee breaks with each member of your team once a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever you can manage? But those kind of ceremonies, can you do a competition? Can you do a game show together, right? For instance, I use a polling platform, Poll Everywhere, and that has competitions and games so that you can have some fun together. Those kind of ceremonies and rituals, and we have very little time today to talk together, but those kinds of rituals and ceremonies, how you start a meeting with a small ritual, 5 minutes of check-in where you don't talk about the work yet, but just say, how are we doing? What's the mood, for instance? Or at the end, how did we do in our team meeting? Those kind of rituals are important. Holding up a picture in front of your screen of your child, your pet, your office, showing your office surroundings so that people get a sense of the context in which your team member is working. All of those things are very, very helpful. Regular check-ins, really, really important. They can be brief, 5 to 10 minutes, but do them individually so that you can ask 3 types of questions. How are you doing? What can I do as a team member to help you to take away an obstacle? And are you clear on what you need to do next as a team member? Those kind of huddle type check-ins with each other can be really helpful. And those informal meeting spaces. So yes, create channels, virtual channels, WhatsApp conversations, etc., about interests that people have. They want to talk about their kids, they want to talk about their pets, they want to tell jokes, right? They want to talk about cooking. All the things that you normally discuss when you bump into the hallway with each other, when you are congregating around the water cooler, when you are getting together in the kitchen, when you're doing a volleyball game after work, you want to try to recreate those informal spaces where people can relate to each other outside the work. It's really, really important. So let's turn to part 2 of my presentation. Then we'll have an audio and chat conversation, and then we'll do a closing poll. So if we can go to, yes, let's talk some more about management tips, tricks, and tools. You've already shared a whole group of them. So something important that I think is to say off the top, and that is we need to emphasize our emotional intelligence skills and our relationships within the team. By emotional intelligence, I mean both your self-awareness around what drives you, your motivations, are you in touch with your moods and your feelings, and how well can you read the moods and feelings of other people, right? So the interesting thing is that when we are constantly on a computer, as we are now, we tend to become more task-oriented. So in team management, you have task orientation and you have relationship orientation. And some people are more task-oriented naturally, and some people are more relationship-oriented. And what is interesting in virtual team leadership is that being on devices all the time tends to make us more task-oriented, but actually we need to be more relationship-oriented in our virtual teams. So that's the first thing I would want to say. Somebody mentioned already on the poll our water coolers. So those places normally when we are co-located, where we congregate, the hallways, right? the kitchen spaces. We take a walk together. We play a pool, or we play soccer or football together. Those things we need to recreate. And we can talk a little bit about things in ways we can do that. We don't want to copy, though, how we manage face-to-face, and I'll get into that. We want to use our synchronous media, so our media where we are meeting in real time with each other, and our asynchronous media where we communicate with each other on our own time, primarily through written form. Our instant chatting, our email, our Google Docs, etc. We want to use the full spectrum of media, but we want to be consistent, and we want to set norms with each other. We want to set protocols with each other as a team. And we want to make our online meetings engaging. So let's unpack all of these things. Next slide, please. So again, leading with emotional intelligence, very important. So prioritize your relationship orientation over your task orientation. Focus on building that trust and that bonding with each other, because we are at a disadvantage as a virtual team. So put extra emphasis on that. So maintain those rituals. If you had rituals as a team before you entered the pandemic, or before you became virtual, even before the pandemic, reinforce them, but make them virtual ceremonies and rituals, because we are craving for that as human beings. Acknowledge, celebrate, and honor people, promote people, make people feel rewarded. Eye contact is super, super important. When we, as is audio, so the tone of our voice, use a better quality microphone if you can do it. When we communicate with each other, we derive meaning from what the other person says. For about 50% of what the other person says, we're watching, we're doing the eye contact. That's how we interpret the signals that somebody else sends. Another 20 to 30% comes from the tone of how we speak, and only 20% is of what we actually say or write. So prioritize audio and video when you need to really engage in deliberation, not for one-way pushing of information. Video, when you are in a meeting and you encourage people to keep their video on, you discourage multitasking. So the research says that we are multitasking about 70 to 80% of the time that we are in virtual meetings. That is a whole lot. If you ask people to have their video on, if your bandwidth allows for it, you discourage that a little bit. So that primacy of video and audio, I cannot emphasize enough, but of course, bandwidth is a real challenge for a lot of people. Next slide. So recreate those water coolers, but don't copy how you manage face-to-face. Don't transpose your face-to-face management tools to your virtual realm in a literal way. Next slide. What do I mean by that? So when we are co-located, we tend to do things in meetings that we should not do in virtual meetings. So don't manage your team via meetings, because the mental drain is enormous, right? Our brains get very tired from trying to interpret the body language of every little square on the screen, because we have so little visual information and it's highly pixelated. We're trying to interpret how our faces of other people move, but it's hard to do that. Chunk up your meetings. So don't have meetings more than 60 to 90 minutes. If you have retreats or workshops, please cut them off into chunks of 2 to 3 hours at the most. Have regular breaks. Mix up your methods. So have 10-15 minutes of one mode, say an individual writing exercise. Then have plenary. Then have breakout groups, do a poll, do some quiet writing again, and then co-create in a Google Doc. That's how you kind of chunk up meetings and you make them more engaging and less draining. You need to put a lot of emphasis on prepping. There's a lot of work before a meeting to make a virtual meeting useful. So send readings ahead of your virtual meetings. Provide links, provide an agenda, have people do pre-readings before a meeting so you don't have to digest it in the meetings. And insist that people test their tech before you have an important meeting. And if you are facilitating your virtual meeting as a virtual team leader, you absolutely need co-facilitators. So you need somebody else than you who monitors the chat function, who looks for the hand up when people want to speak, etc., who monitors tech issues. You need your buddy facilitators. Next slide. So you want to create those spaces virtually where people bump into each other, right? So you want to have your Slack or Teams channels, your WhatsApp channels for fun non-work, as I already said. You want to have those icebreakers, those warm-up exercises. You want to have an arrival moment where we say, okay, we've entered this space. Let's take a breather. Let's do a 1-minute breathing exercise. Whatever works in the culture of your team. Think about those virtual meals together, those virtual coffees. Think about that delivery of a little gift to members of your team through delivery, through sending them in the mail, etc. Those things can really make people feel more connected. And by the way, that bumping into each other virtually is also really important to stimulate creativity and innovation, because a lot of innovation happens from people accidentally bumping into each other. And if you only have structured conversations, you won't have that as much. Next slide. And then the final thing that's really important for you as a team leader, and again, I'm going through this quite quickly given how little time we have, is that you have to spell out the roles of members, the goals and the tasks, and you have to protocol around that. What do I mean by that? You need to document your task flows, how the team will work together, who will work on what sequentially, etc. You need to document that into protocols more explicitly, next slide, than in your face-to-face teams. So you need to make explicit, as I said, what are the goals and the objectives? What expectations do you have from your team members? What is the work process and the task flow that you will follow as a team? And again, how we will communicate via what means of communication, what media, for what purpose is really important that you make that explicit. So let me stop my presentation there. I'm actually just under time, which is great because it means that we can go into discussion on the chat, but also on audio. So let me check in with Julie and Shabnam at this moment in terms of, do you have any people who would like to participate on audio at this moment, or should we take some chat questions?
No one is raising their hand so far, but we do have a couple questions from the chat box.
Okay, do you mind reading them out to me, Shabnam?
Sure. So I think the first one was from Eva Rodriguez.
Yes.
I think we already went through this. What kind of ceremonies and rituals? Did we already go through that?
We did go through that a little bit. Maybe take another one.
Okay, so then the next one I see is, how do you approach virtual leadership in countries where people doing home office are working way longer time than being in the office?
Yeah, that one I tried to address in the sense that I said, but it wasn't a complete answer. I said that we're all on average working actually longer hours. When it comes to, as a team leader, if some of your team members in other countries are working longer hours, then that whole emphasis that I put on emotional intelligence, that includes empathy. So you need to be extra empathetic with your team members around the challenges that they are facing. And we know that there are gendered aspects to the COVID pandemic in terms of workload, as just one example. Many of us don't have the ideal office environment. So empathy is really important. And also, maybe a little bit of a rule around it's okay. It is okay that we're not showing up to our meetings always on time because we're running around trying to make sure that our kids are not in the office with us at the time when we need to start a meeting. It is okay that we're not maybe dressed it is okay that we're dressed more casually. It is okay that we don't always have our stuff together, especially during the pandemic. The kind of list of it is okay needs to be longer. So that kind of empathy, I think, is really important as a team member. What other questions are there on the chat? Or if anybody wants to jump in on audio, go right ahead.
This is Julie. Thanks, Tosca. I do know that we have a question, two questions. I'm going to drop one in. I think one from Amy Chase. Amy, I think if this is your question, or if you have additional questions, you can unmute yourself if you'd like. But the one that she posed is, what is the best method to encourage folks to use video? Women generally feel more self-conscious about whether they're camera ready.
Oh, right. Okay. First of all, what I would do, Amy, I would emphasize that we know from the research that video, that eye contact is so important for establishing and reinforcing trust. And we need that trust now more than ever during this pandemic, right? So emphasizing that being able to look each other in the eye makes it more possible to have good relationships, to have trust in each other, to be more candid with each other in a productive, constructive way, to have empathy with each other, to understand each other. So for all those reasons, video is really important if your bandwidth allows. On that issue of being self-conscious on camera, you know how I resolve that? In Zoom, at least, if you can hide your view of yourself. So if you go to your own Zoom picture and look in the right top box, you see the three dots. If you do a right click on the three dots, you can see hide self view. I'll put it in the chat box. Hide self view. If you choose that, oh, I'm sorry. Julie, would you mind putting that for everybody? I just send it to yourself. Then you don't see yourself anymore. So then you can overcome your self-consciousness. The other thing is to make sure that you have your laptop always at eye level and you look into the camera. So lift it up onto a box or something so that you're not looking down into the camera. That also makes you feel less self-conscious. What other questions are out there?
I have one more, and then I encourage everyone to raise their hand. I'm going to drop it into let's make sure I dropped in the chat box. I think it was from Tori, maybe. What advice do you have for starting a new organization team in a virtual environment? And how do you find the balance between reaching out to learn without bothering, interrupting the workflow of others?
Yeah, good questions. If I understood the first one right, and Tori, please unmute yourself and speak up if I didn't. If you start a new team that starts out virtual from the very beginning, you have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage compared to a team that was first before COVID, co-located or was hybrid, is that everybody is starting with the same kind of set of norms. If you had a hybrid team before, the people who are virtual team members, who are remote team members into a team that otherwise is co-located, are at a distinct advantage. I don't know if you've ever been attend meetings where you are one of the few or the only virtual attendee. it tends to really suck. It's just a very suboptimal experience because often the others in the room are not with you. At least when you're starting your team from scratch in the virtual space, you don't have that disadvantage. What can be difficult for new team members is to do the onboarding. So when you have an intact team and you're adding new team members to it, and that team member enters when the team has gone virtual, picking up on the culture of the team can be more difficult, more challenging. So making sure that new team member has a buddy of somebody who has been in the team for a longer period and can kind of informally coach them on what are the kind of set of expectations and kind of habits and behaviors that we tend to share in the team. What are the kind of jokes we make and what is not appropriate, how to behave, these kind of behavioral norms. It's very helpful to have a buddy for that. So these are just a couple of suggestions, but at least you're all starting off on the same footing. Setting those protocols in place on how you will work, through what medium, for what purpose, and for based on what expectations that you as a team leader will have of your team members is really important. The thing about interrupting is really important. So on the one thing, that was the second question. So on the one thing, media like Slack and other instant chatting things are hugely helpful to be able to quickly respond to each other, solve issues, build on each other's thinking, quickly clarify things, etc. It's great for that. At the same time, if we don't have the opportunity to concentrate, we don't do our best work and we don't get into the zone, the flow of work. So I know some teams who have started to put in place norms where they say, every Monday and every Thursday and Friday, 3 hours are no meetings and no instant communication unless there is an emergency, but at least no meetings. Now, of course, if you're a global team, that's not going to work because of the time zone difference. But you can still try to make sure that certain parts of everybody's work week are off limits for meetings, so that you have 3 hours straight where you have no meetings and there's likely not as much instant communication. So that is one way of resolving it. For the rest, it's really important, for instance, if you use Slack or Microsoft Teams, is that you put in place when you're available and when you're not available. And for you as a team leader, it's really important to communicate to your team members when you are in meetings with other parts of the organization, so that people know why you're not available at that moment for instant chatting, for instance, because you're seeing the boss or you're in a meeting with the senior team leadership, etc. So that your team members understand you're not available, but you'll update them afterwards. So these are a couple of answers. Let me see how we're doing on time. We have a few more minutes, right, Julie?
Yeah, we have about 5 or 6 minutes. You've got 2 more questions, and then maybe we'll go to the mentee, your final mentee.
Nobody wants to speak on audio today?
Yeah, if anyone, yeah, why don't we let someone speak? So we had, I see Ava. Ava, do you want to ask your question? And then there's one other person. I'm going to get the other one. I think it was Jessica, maybe. Ava, you up for speaking aloud?
Yeah, thanks. It's just that we have all witnessed, and we're doing some of the things that you said, like having 15 minutes in each of our staff meetings, so people, and we rotate games so people can share a little bit more about them. But I can sense that the change of the culture of the team has had a different. It's different. It feels different. And just sharing the data that you shared at the beginning and just talking openly about how differently we're feeling. I was just asking if you have any suggestions about that, because I do feel that the levels of trust, the levels, everything that you said at the beginning of your session is totally true in my team, but we haven't addressed it directly.
So you haven't voiced it. So is that what you're feeling about the
Exactly. We have done some things to solve it, but we haven't heard about how everyone's feeling. And I was just thinking, reflecting on if it's good to do it in a group, or should I go one by one in one-on-one meetings to see how they're feeling?
That's a good question. I would, if you're the team leader, Eva, I would do it first one-on-ones. So if you're doing regular 10, 15 minutes check-in one-on-ones anyway, I would make that a standard agenda item for the next week or two. And in a safe space, ask people how they're feeling as to whether the culture changed. And again, by the way, when I use the word culture, I find sometimes people think it's a very fluffy term, or they think about it in kind of these idealized values and principles. No, I'm pulling it down to the level of what are the widely shared habits and behaviors that we have in the team, and the widely shared habits and behavior that we want to reinforce or that we want to encourage or discourage all the time, right? Yes, I would do that first one-on-one, and then I would have a dedicated session. And this is something definitely where you want to do this real time, so synchronous with audio and video, and particularly have video on so that you can maintain some level of eye contact, so that so that you can try to create as much as possible a safe space. It is a hurdle to be in a virtual team compared to face-to-face. For most people, though not for all, depending on your type. It is a bigger hurdle, but there are a number of things you can do to compensate for it. And so maybe you should keep also having creative brainstorms about what else you can do to solve for it.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
You're welcome. Any other questions on video and audio?
I think Jessica Tolliver had a question.
Go right ahead, Jessica.
Okay, so I don't know if Jessica is there. So let me.
How about the chat? Do we still?
Yeah,
have
let me just read her question. Just sorry, I lost it for a minute.
Take your time.
I have it here if you want me to read it.
Yeah, go ahead, Shabnam.
She says that we have many new team members that have joined us during this period. How do you suggest encouraging participation and comfort in speaking in larger groups?
In larger groups, yeah. So a couple of answers, Jessica. First of all, a lot of time in international development organizations, when we are brainstorming, we think we need to do that immediately plenary, and actually you're not getting the best creativity because groupthink starts to set in very quickly, meaning where we're all starting to say, okay, so the kind of the direction of thinking in the group is this, so let me go with that. So I would start actually with some individual brainstorming or writing exercise so that those members in your team who feel a little hesitant to speak up, maybe are encouraged to formulate their thinking. Then I would give them the opportunity, despite everything that I've said about the importance of eye contact in video, if they feel more comfortable speaking off camera, then I would allow them to do that, but with the spoken expectation that over time you want them to develop more of a comfort level. It is really, really important as a team leader that when people disclose their true opinions, especially when they diverge from the kind of the consensus so far, is that culturally speaking that you encourage that divergence, meaning that you celebrate and reward the people who are speaking up in ways that are different from what the general direction of discussion was so far, assuming it's still on point, of course. But you want to encourage diversity of thinking. So if those team members who were shy or reticent before to speak up, if they see that you are celebrating their contributions, they may well feel more comfortable over time. Obviously, if anybody else in the team kind of shuts down those things, you need to immediately hold that person to account, and other people need to see you hold that person to account. You need to call out that behavior as something that is not wanted, because team members watch what you do as a team leader. They don't watch as much what you say, but they very much watch what you're doing. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, I don't think there are any more questions, and maybe, you know, I know we're about the end.
Do we have time for the quick poll or not?
Yeah, let's do the, yeah, we can do the Menti, and then I'm just gonna put in some of the final comments inside the chat, but we'll, in terms of what's next. But let's do Menti. I think it'll be great for others to see.
And so the question in the final poll is, one takeaway. What is one thing you intend to experiment with as virtual team manager following this session? And again, I apologize for the very brief treatment of the topic, but 55 minutes is what we have. So that's what we then try to use to the best. Virtual coffee chats. Using video more. Yes, yes. So I know team leaders, by the way, who make a point of inviting each team member once a week or so, or once every 2 or 3 weeks for that virtual coffee. Virtual team lunch, yeah, just the idea of eating together, even while looking at a screen, still creates a little bit of that sense. One-on-one chats, creative icebreakers, yeah. And having some fun together, it's so difficult at the time that we're going through. So really would encourage that. Yes, relationships over tasks, that is one of the most important takeaways that I would like you to please take with you. Different media for different means. Exactly, exactly. Okay, this gives me a sense of honor and promoting others. Yes, this gives me a sense of what you took away. So thank you for that. I'm handing it back over to Shabnam and Julie.
Oh my gosh, Tosca, this was incredible. I want to just like tell everyone, give her a round of applause. It was really so practical. So I just want to thank everyone that were here, and thanks for staying the few extra minutes. I think it was important because it is so practical. You know, I've attended a lot of these sessions and I learned so much today, you know, about virtual learning and virtual teams. And this was really by far, I'm not just saying that to you, Tosca, but this is by far like one of the best.
Thank you.
So anyway, we have, I want to remind you a couple of things. First, all the slide deck and this recording will be on the conference site after the conference. We have to upload some of that, but please, you'll have access to it. All attendees, just log on. You can get, hear the questions, tips. Reach out to Tosca if you have any questions. She's available. Her contact information will be on the slide deck. She's also registered, so you can reach out to her through the conference. Fill out the survey, if you will, please. We'll send that out at the end of the conference today. And then finally, head to the plenary now. It's our closing plenary. We're so happy that you all are here for the conference. We hope that it's been a great experience for you. It's our first virtual conference. We tried to make it as interactive as possible. So thank you to everyone, especially Tosca. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.